Sometimes fate arrives disguised as a need, and people confuse generosity with self-interest. Thomas Mitchell watched the dust rise on the main road of Copper Creek when the wagon appeared on the horizon. The midday sun turned everything into a golden mirage, but there was something real in that slow movement that cut through the desert. He adjusted his hat over his tired eyes and continued repairing the fence on his small ranch. By the time he was 52, Thomas had learned that too much curiosity could bring too much trouble. The wagon stopped at the entrance to the city, right in front of Martha's Hall. Thomas could see from afar the two figures that descended, a young woman carrying a small child in her arms. Even from a distance, it was possible to perceive the fatigue in her movements, the way she looked around as if looking for hope in a place where she had already lost faith, even before arriving. Martha left the hall, wiping her hands on her apron. Thomas knew that gesture. It meant that she was assessing the situation, deciding whether to offer help or pretend not to have seen anything. Martha had a good heart, but she also had bills to pay and a reputation to maintain. Copper Creek was no place for lonely women with children, especially when they had no money in their pockets. The wind carried fragments of the conversation to Thomas. Loose words that painted a familiar picture. Dead husband, money gone, place to stay. The woman held the child tighter with each word, as if she could protect it from the world with the strength of her arms alone. Thomas had seen this scene before. I knew how it ended most of the time. Martha nodded slowly. It wasn't evil, it was reality. The salon could barely keep its doors open, and hosting strangers was a luxury she couldn't afford. The woman nodded, understanding, but Thomas watched as she looked at the child and then at the empty horizon. It was the look of someone who is counting the last options before having none left. That's when James Crawford came along. Crawford owned the largest property in the surrounding area, a man who had enough money to buy half the town if he wanted to. He was also known to have very specific opinions about what people owed him in exchange for favors. Thomas felt his stomach tighten when he saw Crawford approach the woman with that smile he wore whenever he saw the opportunity. The conversation was brief. Crawford gestured toward his big house on the top of the hill, spoke with open hands, like a generous man offering a simple solution to a complicated problem. The woman listened, waving the child in her arms, and Thomas could see even from afar the conflict on her face. I knew she was weighing options that weren't really options. Thomas dropped the hammer and walked toward the city. I had no plan, I had no idea what I was going to say or do. He just knew that there was something wrong in that scene, something that made his stomach turn like when he ate spoiled meat. Crawford had the right to offer work. He had the right to help anyone he wanted. But Thomas had known Crawford long enough to know that generosity was never priceless. The woman's name was Eleanor, and the child was a girl of about 3 years old, with eyes too big for her small face. Crawford was already explaining the conditions of the work when Thomas got close enough to listen. Cooking, cleaning, taking care of the big house, housing and food guaranteed for her and the girl, all very civilized, all very convenient. Thomas stopped in the shadow of the hardware store and continued listening. Crawford was being careful with the words, but the meaning was clear to anyone who wanted to see. Eleanor understood too. Thomas watched as she closed her eyes for a moment, as if she were doing math that doesn't add up at all. The girl began to cry, a low, tired cry that spoke of hunger and many hours on the road. Eleanor calmed her down, whispering words that the wind wouldn't let Thomas hear. But he saw the decision form on her face, saw the exact moment she realized she had no real choice. Crawford reached out to seal the deal. Eleanor looked at her hand, then at her daughter, then at the empty horizon that offered no alternative. Her hand moved slowly towards his, as if signing a document he doesn't want to sign. That's when Thomas stepped out of the shadow and walked toward them. I didn't know what I was going to say yet, but I knew I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. Some things were too simple to require much thought. Some things were just right or wrong, and letting Crawford take advantage of the desperation of a woman with a child was definitely on the wrong end of the line. The sun continued to burn over Copper Creek, and the dust continued to dance on Main Street. But something was changing in the air. Thomas could feel it. It was like when a desert storm approaches. Everything is too quiet before the first thunder echoes through the mountains. Crawford turned when he heard Thomas's footsteps approaching. His smile changed. It became more tense, like when someone is interrupted in the middle of an important business. Eleanor looked on too, holding her daughter tighter, as if any change in the situation could make things even worse for her. Thomas stopped a few feet from the group and took off his hat, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The gesture gave him a few seconds to think about what to say. Crawford was waiting, with that forced patience of a rich man who doesn't like to be bothered. Eleanor just stared, trying to understand if Thomas represented another complication, or perhaps a hope. The girl in Eleanor's arms had stopped crying and was now watching Thomas with that natural, childlike curiosity. Her big eyes seemed too big for the thin face, and Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He remembered his own childhood, the times he and his mother had depended on the kindness of strangers to keep from starving. Thomas looked at Crawford and then at Eleanor. He knew he had to be careful. Crawford had influence in the city, he had money, and he had the kind of pride that made men hold grudges for a long time. But I also knew that if I didn't do anything now, I would carry the weight of that choice for the rest of my life. Thomas's house was small, but it had 2 bedrooms. He had lived alone since his wife died of a fever 3 years ago. The place was half abandoned, half forgotten, as it happens when a man lives only for too long. But it had a solid roof, walls that protected it from the wind and cold of the night, and a kitchen where you could prepare a decent meal. Thomas put the hat back on his head and looked directly at Eleanor. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said he had work on the ranch, honest work that paid enough to support a woman and a child. She talked about the vacant room in her house, about how the kitchen needed someone who knew how to really cook, about how the place was in need of female presence to feel like home, instead of just home again. Crawford listened to everything, with an expression that was slowly changing. At first he seemed just surprised, then bored, finally, clearly angry. Thomas could almost hear his thoughts. Who was that poor farmer to interfere in the affairs of an important man? Crawford had plans for Eleanor, plans that didn't include her having better alternatives. Eleanor looked from Thomas to Crawford, then back to Thomas. He was calculating, weighing options that he suddenly had. Thomas saw when something changed on her face, when she realized that she might not have to accept the first offer that came her way, no matter how bad it was. The girl in her arms smiled at Thomas, a small, shy smile that made his heart race. Crawford tried to regain control of the situation. He talked about the advantages of the big house, about the security of working for an established man, about how Thomas was just a small farmer without much to offer. His words were polite on the surface, but loaded with menace underneath. Thomas got the message. Crawford wasn't going to forget this interference. But Eleanor had already made her decision. Thomas saw in her eyes the exact moment he chose. It was not a decision based on fear or despair, as it had been with Crawford. It was a choice based on something different, something that had to do with how Thomas looked at his daughter, how he talked about honest work, how he offered help without demanding anything in return. Eleanor thanked Crawford for his generosity, but explained that she would accept Thomas's offer. His voice was firm, polite, but definitive. Crawford blushed, first in surprise, then in anger. Thomas saw the fury grow on his face and braced himself for whatever might come. Men like Crawford were not used to hearing no, especially in front of other people. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with tension that everyone could feel. Martha had left the hall again and was watching the scene from the balcony, probably realizing that something important was happening. A few other people also began to pay attention, stopping at their activities to see what was unfolding on the main street. Crawford looked at Thomas with the kind of look that promised trouble to come. Then he turned to Eleanor and spoke in a low, controlled, but meaningful voice. She said that she was making a mistake, that Thomas was not able to take care of her and her daughter, that she would regret her decision. They weren't exactly threats, but they weren't just observations either. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that exploding now would only make things worse for Eleanor and the girl. Crawford was testing the limits, seeing how far he could push before anyone reacted. Thomas took a deep breath and just nodded to Eleanor, indicating that it was time for them to get out of there. Eleanor carried her daughter toward the wagon to pick up the few things they had. Thomas followed her, offering to help with the luggage. There were only 2 small suitcases and a blanket, all that was left of a lifetime. Thomas carried the bags without commenting on how little it was, without asking questions about what had happened to the rest. When they turned to leave, Crawford was still standing in the middle of the street watching. His face no longer showed anger, only a cold determination that was much more dangerous. Thomas knew he had made a powerful enemy that day. He also knew that he did not regret the choice he had made at all. The walk to Thomas's ranch was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Eleanor carried her daughter, who had fallen asleep during the journey, while Thomas carried the bags and led the way. The sun began to decline, painting the sky orange hues that made the desert seem less hostile, almost welcoming. The house appeared on the horizon as a promise of rest after days on the road. It was a simple but solid construction, made of sturdy wood that had weathered many sandstorms and still stood tall. The front porch was a little crooked, in need of some repairs, and the garden that once flourished there was now just dry land, with a few hardy plants that refused to die. Thomas stopped in front of the house and looked at the place with the eyes of someone who is seeing for the first time in a long time. She realized how abandoned it was, how the absence of feminine care showed itself in every detail. The faded curtains, the dead plants in the pots on the balcony, the paint peeling off the walls. It was the home of a man who had given up on making the place look like home. Eleanor lowered her daughter to the ground, and the girl ran to the balcony, curious to explore the new environment. He had the energy of small children who can find wonder anywhere, transform any space into a field of adventures. Eleanor followed her with her eyes, but Thomas saw the concern on her face, the way she evaluated every detail of the place that would be her new home. Thomas opened the front door, and the smell of a closed house greeted them. It was a mixture of dust, loneliness, and memories that were stuck in the walls. He apologized for the mess, explaining that he hadn't had visitors in a long time, and that he had gotten used to living anyway. Eleanor just nodded, understanding, and began to observe the rooms with the practical eye of a woman used to transforming spaces into homes. The kitchen needed deep cleaning, but it had a good stove and solid table where you could prepare decent meals. The room Thomas offered to Eleanor and her daughter was small but airy, with a window that overlooked the distant mountains. Thomas had taken his clothes out of the closet during the journey, leaving the space free for the 2 of them. It was a simple gesture, but Eleanor realized the care behind it. The girl found a cat that Thomas didn't even know lived there. The animal appeared from some hidden corner of the house, thin but not wild, as if it had been waiting for company for a long time. The child laughed for the first time since Thomas had seen her. A sound that filled the house with life in ways he had forgotten was possible. Thomas showed the well at the back of the house, explained how the water pump worked and where Eleanor could wash clothes. He talked about the chickens that lived free on the grounds, about the abandoned vegetable garden that he could perhaps produce again with proper care. Each explanation was given with the hesitation of a man who did not know how to receive people in his house, how to share space that had been his own for so long. Eleanor listened attentively, asking practical questions about the routine, about the work that needed to be done. Her questions showed that she understood how to run the house, how to take care of animals, how to make small repairs. Thomas realized that he had found not only someone who needed help, but someone who could help as well. When the sun had gone down completely, Thomas lit the lanterns and prepared a simple dinner with what he had in the pantry. Eleanor insisted on helping, even though he protested that she was a guest and should rest. But she was already moving around the kitchen as if she belonged, finding pots and spices, turning basic ingredients into a meal that smelled like home. The girl sat on the kitchen floor, playing with the cat and watching the adults move around her. Thomas realized how natural the presence of the two of them was there, how the house seemed less empty, less silent. It had been years since I heard a child's laughter between those walls, years since I had smelled food being prepared with care. During dinner, Eleanor told her story in careful words, chosen so as not to frighten her daughter, who was eating next to her. She talked about her husband who died in an accident at work, about how debts consumed everything they had, about the weeks on the road looking for a place where they could start over. His voice was firm, without self-pity, just reporting facts as someone who has already accepted what cannot change. Thomas listened without interrupting, without asking the questions that he knew were natural, but that might be too painful to answer. When she finished, he just waved, showing that he understood without needing further explanation. Some sufferings were too great to fit into words, and some stories were better respected with silence. After dinner, Thomas showed Eleanor where the things that were kept. The first few weeks passed like water running over desert rocks, slowly but steadily, changing the landscape without making a sound. Eleanor established herself in the routine of the house, with a naturalness that surprised even Thomas. She would wake up before dawn, brew strong coffee, and start the day tending to the chickens and the small garden she had decided to revive. The girl, whom Thomas discovered was named Sarah, adapted to her new home with the ease of young children. She followed her mother around the house, helping the way 3-year-olds help, more hindering than helping, but bringing joy that made up for any inconvenience. The cat, which Thomas decided to call Rusty because of the rusty color of his fur, became the girl's constant companion. Thomas realized how their presence transformed not only the house, but himself. He went back to worrying about his appearance, shaving every day, changing his shirt when it got too dirty. Small cares that he had abandoned when he lived alone, as if there was no reason to care about these things when no one was looking. Eleanor cooked meals that made the kitchen smell like Thomas remembered his childhood, when his mother was still alive and the house was a place of warmth and security. She repaired the curtains, planted flowers in the vases on the porch, made small repairs that Thomas had left for later for so long that he had forgotten about them. The house began to feel like home again, but Crawford hadn't forgotten. The first sign of trouble came when Thomas went to town to buy supplies. The general store merchant, who had always been cordial, now barely looked him in the eye. The farrier refused to shoe Thomas's horse, claiming to be too busy, even though the workshop was clearly empty. In the tavern, conversation stopped when Thomas entered and resumed in whispers when he left. Thomas understood the message. Crawford had spread the word that anyone who did business with Thomas would be contradicting an important man. In a small town like Copper Creek, that kind of pressure worked. Most people depended on Crawford's goodwill in one way or another, whether buying products, needing loans, or simply wanting to avoid trouble. Eleanor noticed the change in Thomas's behavior when he returned from town. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he checked the locks at night, how he looked more closely at any strange movement around the ranch. She didn't ask questions, but she began to keep Sarah closer to home, more attentive to the sounds coming from outside. One morning, Thomas found 3 of his chickens dead in the chicken coop. There were no marks of predators, no sign that wild animals had invaded the place. The birds were simply dead, arranged in a way that made it clear that it was a message, not an accident. Thomas buried the chickens without commenting on the incident with Eleanor, but she saw when he started loading the shotgun as he left for work. The petty sabotage continued, fences cut during the night, tools that mysteriously disappeared, the pit pump clogged with rocks and dirt. Never anything big enough to warrant calling the sheriff, never anything that could be proven. Just constant pressure, a reminder that Crawford hadn't forgotten and wasn't going to forgive. Thomas quietly repaired every damage, replaced every lost tool, cleaned up every mess left by the nocturnal visitors. Eleanor helped when she could, without asking questions, without complaining about the situation in which her presence had put Thomas. Sarah continued to play in the yard, protected from the tension by the care of the adults around. One afternoon, when Thomas was returning from the field, he found Eleanor sitting on the porch with a worried expression. Sarah was asleep indoors, and Eleanor had taken advantage of the quiet moment to think. Thomas sat next to her, waiting for her to say what was on her mind. He knew that expression. He had seen it before in his wife when she was struggling with a difficult decision. Eleanor spoke softly, so as not to wake Sarah. He said he realized the problems his presence was causing, that he saw how Crawford was putting pressure on Thomas, and how it was affecting his life. She talked about the possibility of leaving, of looking for another place where she could start over without bringing complications to good people who just tried to help her. Thomas listened in silence, but nodded slowly when she finished. He explained that problems like Crawford existed everywhere, that powerful men always found ways to put pressure on those who opposed them. He said that leaving now would be like giving Crawford a victory, showing that intimidation worked, encouraging behavior that hurt innocent people. In addition, Thomas admitted something he had only recently noticed. The house had become home again. Sarah had brought joy he thought he had lost forever, and Eleanor had restored purpose to his life. It wasn't just them who needed the security of the house. He also needed the company, the feeling of caring for someone, of having a reason to wake up each morning. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, looking at the distant mountains that shone golden in the late afternoon sun. Thomas respected the silence, understanding that she was weighing options, considering a future that neither of them could fully predict. Sarah woke up and appeared on the porch, still sleepy, looking for her mother's lap. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was firm. He said he would stay, but only if Thomas was sure that was what he wanted. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because I really believed that they could build something good together, despite the difficulties. Thomas looked at her, then at Sarah, then at the house that had become home. His answer came without hesitation. He said he was sure that he was ready to face whatever was necessary to protect what they had built. Eleanor smiled for the first time since the troubles began, and Sarah laughed without knowing why, just feeling the joy of the adults around. That night, Thomas checked all the locks again, but with a different feeling. It wasn't just protecting property. He was protecting family, protecting the future, protecting the possibility of happiness that he had found when he least expected it. Crawford could continue with the intimidation games, but Thomas had decided he wasn't going to back down. The final confrontation came one spring morning, when the first flowers were beginning to sprout in the garden that Eleanor had replanted. Crawford showed up at the ranch, accompanied by two men, not exactly threatening, but making it clear that the conversation would be different from other times. Thomas went out to greet them on the porch, keeping the rifle within reach, but not in his hands. Eleanor kept Sarah inside the house, but stood at the kitchen window, watching. Rusty the cat disappeared under the porch, as if feeling the tension in the air. Crawford spoke in a calm, controlled voice. He offered to buy Thomas's ranch at a fair price, said he was expanding the properties and that the land fit perfectly into his plans. He mentioned how good it would be for Thomas to have money to start over somewhere else, away from the problems that had been bothering his life lately. Thomas listened to the proposal until the end, then nodded slowly. He replied that the ranch was not for sale, that he had his own plans for the land, that he intended to stay there for the rest of his life. His voice was firm, without unnecessary challenge, but also without room for doubt. Crawford insisted, increased the offer, talked about the advantages of accepting an amicable deal instead of letting things get complicated. The two men who accompanied him positioned themselves in a way that made it clear that they were not just witnesses to the conversation. Thomas realized the implied threat, but he didn't back down. That's when Eleanor left the house. She walked slowly until she was next to Thomas, carrying Sarah in her arms. She didn't say anything, just stood there, showing that she was with him, that she wasn't going to let him face Crawford alone. Sarah looked curiously at the visitors, not understanding the tension, but feeling safe in her mother's arms. Crawford looked at Eleanor with an expression that mixed frustration with something darker. He said that she had made the wrong choice that day in the city, that she could have had a comfortable, safe life. Now she was tied to a stubborn man who couldn't recognize reality when she appeared in front of him. Eleanor replied in a clear voice without hesitation. He said that he had made exactly the right choice, that he had found a real home, a real family, a life worth living. It was not an easy life, but it was a life with dignity, with respect, with true love. These things were worth more than any comfort Crawford could offer. The change in Crawford's face was visible. He realized that he had completely lost, that Eleanor had not only rejected his original offer, but was now publicly choosing Thomas over him. For a man used to getting what he wanted, that was unbearable humiliation. Thomas saw the anger grow in Crawford's eyes and braced himself for whatever might come. But then something unexpected happened. Sarah laughed, a crystalline sound that cut through the tension like a sharp knife. She had seen a butterfly perched on a flower near the porch and was pointing to it, delighted at the discovery. The child's laughter seemed to break the spell of anger that dominated the moment. Crawford looked at Sarah, then Eleanor, then Thomas. Something in him seemed to give up, as if he finally understood that he had lost not only the argument, but something much bigger that he could no longer recover. Crawford waved to the two men and began to walk away. Before mounting the horse, he turned one last time to Thomas. He said he would respect the decision to stay, but that Thomas should understand that he had chosen a difficult life. It was not a threat, just an observation by a man who knew well how the world worked. Thomas just nodded, accepting what Crawford said without agreeing or disagreeing. I knew that life would be difficult at times. I knew that there would be challenges ahead, but I also knew that they would face it together as a family, and that made all the difference. The three men left, leaving only dust on the road. Thomas, Eleanor, and Sarah stood on the porch, watching until they disappeared into the horizon. The silence that followed was not heavy or threatening. It was a silence of peace, of a problem solved, of a future that could finally be planned without fear. Sarah climbed down from her mother's lap and ran after the butterfly, laughing as it flew away. Rusty appeared from under the balcony and followed the girl as he always did. Eleanor and Thomas stood side by side, watching their daughter play in the garden that had become a symbol of a new beginning. Thomas realized that the storm had passed. Not just the threat of Crawford, but the inner storm he had been carrying since his wife died. Eleanor and Sarah had brought more than company into their lives. They had brought purpose, joy, reason, to wake up each morning with hope rather than just resignation. The sun shone on the small ranch, illuminating the house that had become home, the vegetable garden that was blooming again, the family that had been formed in an unexpected but true way. Thomas knew at that moment that all the hardships had been worth it. Some storms only serve to clear the air and make room for better days. If you liked this Wild West story, don't miss the next adventures to come, stories of courage, redemption, and the values that define a person's character in the wilderness. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting narrative.